Welcome to everybody in my function as speaker of the research cluster Society, Culture and Motion at the University of Halle. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce the editor of the print fresh book Bounded Knowledge. It's so print fresh that it is not there yet. You can imagine how it is printed at this moment. It is also my pleasure because in the last decade, Daniele, as a postdoc researcher in our research cluster, was and is a central pillar in our cluster. As such, we had also the honor to host one of the conferences in Halle leading to the book. And for my pleasure, more important is the fact that Daniele Cantini is a great innovator in Orientalism, one could say. Said criticized Orientalism in his famous book as a science glorifying the foregone past of the Middle East and devaluating the present to make colonialism possible. In this line of thought, still thousands of social science studies of Orientalists are produced on the role of religion each year, I would say. This still is mind-boggling for all people thinking about Arab countries, its own elites included. In contrast to this, the new Orientalism of Daniele Cantini focuses at the present time knowledge production at Arab universities in empirical studies, thus giving a social science insight in the contradictions of the current production of intellectual elites. He did this already, Kai Klesse mentioned this in his tremendous PhD thesis on youth and education in the Middle East, published by Tauris in 2016. And he elaborates it further with a new book on bounded knowledge, which gives a far more nuanced look of the hidden protagonists of the Arab Spring that do not fit in the cliches of Western democracy and Islamism so often used in short-sighted reports. Therefore, I'm looking forward to the book presentation because it gives an insight into ways of the production of possible futures. And Daniele, I hope you enlighten us, please.
Thank you, Reinhold, for these very nice words, introduction. Thanks you, Kai, and thanks also to the Research Cluster Society and Culture in Motion in Halle and the Leibniz-Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin for co-hosting this event. It's of course a pity not to be able to convene all together in presence, but we will do it as soon as possible. And of course, thank you all for taking the time and being here. And I would also like to thank our two discussant today who accepted to discuss the book with me. So Mushira El-Gheziri, Vice Director of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and David Mills, who is Associate Professor for Anthropology at Oxford Universities. Both were involved in the plotting of this book at earlier stages, and in the case of Mushira, even before the project led to the book actually started. So thank you for taking the time. As you know, Egypt is among the most studied countries in the Middle East, North Africa region. There's no shortage of research on that particular country, and particularly not on Cairo. However, there has been almost no attention at all in any language, including Arabic, to doctoral studies at universities in Egypt. And one reviewer of the book kindly presented it as a pioneering analysis of the first study of such a kind in the region as a whole, not just in Egypt. And of course, as some of you who are more familiar with my work know, I'm working on universities since some time. And in this project, I took up the role, I wanted to focus on how research is produced. So universities are normally taken as spaces for youth people to gather, or for organizations and so on and so forth. And I did study them in these ways. And this project is only about what they produced. And I took the PhD, the doctoral moment, as one of the as a focal point to look through the entanglements of producing knowledge in Egypt and at Egyptian public universities. The basic understanding is that research is important for every society. And of course, it is not always the same. So what knowledge is, what appropriate knowledge is, and the social construction of knowledge and of researchers are themes to be researched and not to be taken for granted, particularly in countries that are known for being not particularly easy for researchers. So this was the first starting point. And this starting point came from so this project started after I had already lived in Egypt for almost 3 years. And the idea was really to try to find a topic that would allow a real collaboration with local scholars, not just an analysis from afar, but a study done together. All right. And so knowledge in this sense is understood both as a content of disciplines and as a context, so the context within which it is produced. Taking, as I said, the PhD as a focal point and the moment in which researchers are formed. So the possibility of collaboration, of working together, became a central part of the methodology. I will elaborate on this later of this project. And the collaboration is not as a goal in itself, but as a way of situating the space-time existence, the conditions of doing research, as taken, as I said, as an object of study. Now, the project started with two further assumptions. The first one is the importance of doctoral studies worldwide. In the past decades, in the literature on knowledge production and higher education studies, the doctorate is increasingly seen as a moment in which less a moment of apprenticeship, in which an individual relationship between someone studying or struggling to acquire knowledge deals with someone who owns knowledge, and more a moment in which junior researchers are junior but partners in the production of research. So this is worldwide, of course. Yeah. And this moment is understood more and more, even from a legal perspective, for example, within the frame of the European Union funding schemes, as a moment in which, I mean, the PhD students are already researchers. And this is the single, perhaps more important event in the career of a researcher, or at least the first. The PhD is a truly formative and critical moment. The second assumption at the beginning of this project was, of course, 2011. So the revolution in Egypt seen as a moment of opening, as a moment of new possibilities. I had studied universities in Egypt already before 2011, and I knew some of the constraints on doing research. And when the revolution erupted, I thought this could have been a moment to start looking at whether these conditions were actually being changed. Now, I don't need to elaborate on the fact that by the time the project started, because obtaining research funding is also not that easy. So in the spring 2014, situation changed considerably already. And by the time the project ended in March 2016, had changed for good for the time being. So some initial, the second initial assumption, so that the moment was conducive, was the project during the course of the project proved to be not the case. Also, the first assumption proved very early on to be negated. Most people I spoke with and the researcher associated with the project spoke with negated that the PhD at Egyptian universities is a moment or is a critical, crucial moment or as a rite of passage. People would say that master theses are normally of better quality and that PhD theses are in many cases just a prosecution with less interest and even less time involved. of MA thesis, the importance of the PhD research to define oneself as a scholar was also negated, because in many cases, PhD candidates are already faculty members. And so the acquiring of a PhD is more a matter of internal promotion rather than proving oneself able or capable of being a researcher in any given disciplines. And to the point that under the rubric of Dirasat al-Ulya, so postgraduate studies, MA and PhD theses are constantly put together. It's very difficult to come across statistics that differentiate between the two. And so this is the first element of the negation of the importance of the PhD. The second is the general context of ruination. So at least since the 1970s, the academic profession ceased to be in Egypt an attractive option for middle classes, mostly due to the deterioration of working conditions. Teaching in the Gulf became a preferred option for many, and along, of course, the very old and since the beginning established practice of simply going abroad to what is today called the global north. And most of the doctoral candidates are of a higher age than their European counterparts. Mid-30s is an average age in Egypt. And almost all of them have full-time jobs elsewhere because the PhD is not providing salaries normally, which of course deteriorates the possibility of doing research. And this before the third major issue that is constraining research at the doctoral level at Egyptian universities, which is of course political and societal control. So whereas in other Arab countries, for example, in places like Yemen before the war, professors would give PhD candidates the title of the research. That's not the case in Egypt, but faculty research topics have to be approved at the faculty level. And let's say that there is a strong incentive not to be dealing with any particularly hot or difficult topic. So this is so the two assumptions of the project were very quickly dispersed. This in the middle of an overarching discourse of crisis. This is nothing new for anybody who is familiar with the region, but this discourse of crisis is omnipresent since at least the 1970s, which makes it more akin to a condition rather than a real crisis. Real meaning here something that is extraordinary compared to a normal state of affairs. And the higher education sector in particular is the object is normally represented as being in crisis. The Arab Human Development Report already in 2003, up to the book written by Sari Hanafi and Rigas Arbanitis, labeling research as the impossible promise, analysis on how doing research, particularly in the social science and humanities in most Arab regions, on how doing research is almost, is very difficult, if not outright impossible, do abound. And so these crises, of course, affects also the PhD. So if no real research is done at universities, or these possibilities negated, then also the possibility of understanding the doctorate as a moment of passage becomes more problematic. Yet, this discourse of crisis goes hand in hand with the staggering growth in the system, both of number of universities, of number of students, even of number of doctoral students. In Egypt, if we have to take the numbers offered by the CAPMAS, so by the Central Population Government Authority at face value, Egypt is now the 9th country in the world for PhD produced, not only in the social science and humanities. I couldn't verify this, of course, but this points to the fact that this discourse of crisis goes hand in hand with the discourse, with the practice of growth. Egypt is inserted in the world system also at the research level. So for example, Egypt is a partner in many European Union funded projects. Egypt is home to many international organizations, some of which are commissioning research. Cairo is, or at least until a few years ago, was a clear regional hub for research. So this dearth of research goes hand in hand with the market for researchers. And most of these researchers, not all of them, of course, some of them are trained abroad, but some of them are also trained locally. And this is an important thing to be kept in mind. And despite all societal and political constraints on research, the importance of the higher education sector and of research is routinely restated by the by the governments, different Egyptian governments. So to put it in the introduction, I elaborate on this unknown, known, or public secret. So this idea that this discourse of crisis goes very closely hand in hand with actually a continued practice of research training that continues unabated and actually keeps increasing in numbers. And I argued that making these conditions and their analysis a topic of research is necessary to move toward a more ethical ethics of a more equitable ethics of research collaboration. And so it is too easy to dismiss the research in these countries as being an impossible promise. Of course, there's no denying of the constraints faced by researchers, yet there is ongoing programs and an insertion into the international market for research. Now, a bit into the book content. Before I wanted to say, so hence, because of this ethics of research collaboration, this project had to be carried out in the most collaborative way possible. So of course, funding was coming from Germany, and I also would acknowledge the help of funding from the German Ministry of Education and Research and the management of these funds by the Orient Institute Beirut. And they were greatly supportive, particularly at difficult junctures. And so funding was coming from the global north, so we couldn't actually change this, but the researchers associated with the project were all given as much freedom as possible to choose their own topic of research within the frame of the project. And during the project, we tried to have as much training sessions as possible in order to try to establish a common ground. Now, this is not something that is, I always thought about this collaborative spirit of inquiry as being necessary for this particular topic of analysis. So it's not me telling the world and Egyptians how their own institutions of higher education are running. It's about trying to work together to understand the actual conditions and possibilities. Now, very briefly, because I wanted to, I don't want to take too much time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I just say a couple of words on the book, and then I hand it over to Mushira. So the book contains an introduction and a chapter on the historical development of doctoral studies. And then there are 3 case studies of 3 different departments: the Faculty of Sociology at Cairo University, a particular international doctoral program at the Faculty of Economics and Political Sciences, also at Cairo University, and the Faculty of Tourism at Alexandria University. And so these chapters deal with how doctoral studies changed in the last decades at these particular settings. And then we moved on to analyzing topics, and particularly topics like gender or heritage or critical theory, which unfortunately is not included in the book. And so the knowledge produced on these topics at public universities and put in comparison with the knowledge produced on these topics elsewhere. And then we have a few extra chapters originating after the project actually ended. A chapter by David Mills, on which I'm not going to say a word because he's having the word after Mushira. A chapter by Jonathan Kriener, who was leading another research project on universities in the Arab world, and he focuses on academic freedom in one particular faculty at a time of very heated political conflict. And then a chapter by Hala Kamal on how knowledge is done also by translating books, in this particular case on feminism. And this is all closed by a wonderful afterword by Mona Abaza, who puts this analysis in perspective with what happens at universities in other parts of the globe. So by way of conclusion, I would like to simply repeat that for me, studying higher education institutions is equal to study the society at large. And these causes of crisis and growth go hand in hand together, limitation and possibilities, and increasingly in an interconnectedness in a world of increased inequalities. Thank you. And Mushira, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniele. I might just add a few words of introduction to Dr. Mushira El-Jaziri, who is our discussant, our first of two discussants here. And she's been the Associate Director of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences since April 2019. She earned a BA and MA in Political Science at the American University in Cairo, and her PhD in Development Studies from Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Her research and commentary on the status of social science in the Arab region and on education and employment of women has been published in journals including Feminist Formations and UNESCO's World Social Science Report. She served as co-editor of Arabic volumes resulting from major conferences on the state of the social science in the Arab world, and also on the role of education in building citizenship. So related topics to ours today. And she's translated books from English to Arabic on violence against women in Algeria, Help People and Pollution, and gender inequalities in the Arab world. Before joining the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, she has worked at the Ford Foundations, where with a focus on advancing the social justice in higher education institutions. Thank you very much, Mushira, and with this, I'll pass on to you.
Well, thank you, Kai. Thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to be in this book launch, Bounded Knowledge, Doctoral Studies in Egypt. I'm happy to have come full circle in a very nice way with Daniele over his book. So several years ago in Cairo, I witnessed, as he said, the beginnings of the book project, and Daniele invited me to several of his workshops, which you organized for the authors. And I remember I was also a discussant for a few of them. So really very gratifying to be here again for the final discussion of the end product. So I really enjoyed reading the book, and I learned a lot from reading it. It couldn't have been more timely for reasons that we all know. The universities are all facing challenges the world over, social sciences and humanities in particular. Inequalities in access and completion of higher education is causing a lot of anxiety about labor market insertion and about mobility, social mobility. And of course, in the global south, Egypt included, there is the additional problem of knowledge production, and our own Arab region has been described in the various reports as a place of knowledge deficit. So Danielle's book is really a much welcome ethnographic work on a topic that I know has not been discussed or written about in Egypt, the focus on doctoral studies as a liminal moment in the life of PhD students, but one that is severely actually diluted by the challenges they face. And it's important because it shifts the focus of the debate on higher education away from the very misguided sort of controversy on the role of universities as vehicles for the production of manpower for the labor force, and the very notorious sort of discourse on the mismatch between universities and the labor market. So it's a welcome contribution by an anthropologist, and I see in his work a great effort to offset the noticeable imbalance in writing and in addressing higher education that is now very much dominated by economists and international organizations. And at the same time, I have to say this quickly, but I think it's important. At the same time, as I was reading Bounded Knowledge, I came across, I don't know if Daniela knows about this, I came across Adnan El-Amin's book. He's a famous educationalist from Lebanon. His most recent book is on the theme of knowledge production as well. And the title, and I find this very amusing, is called Producing Meaninglessness. I mean, that's really the title, Arab Research Traditions. So you can imagine from the title what the contents are. Anyway, it's just very nice and actually wonderful that there are more books now written on higher education from the knowledge production perspective, even if it has this title, which is really a bit scary. So Danielle's project was of interest to me 8 years ago. And at the time, as Kai said, I was the program officer for higher education at the Ford Foundation. And the work we did at the foundation had a focus on social sciences as marginalized disciplines. And it's still of great relevance to me now in my interest in working as at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences for the promotion of social sciences. And in both cases, I've always been concerned with the universities as institutions in their own rights, actors, but also the products of the universities, the scholars, the students, and the researchers that come out of the higher education system. So I really come to this discussion from the angle of reform of higher education and improvements that we can do to the system and change. The question of change and how change comes about is of great interest to me personally. I actually think that Daniela's book is not only significant for its contribution to knowledge production, but I do see in it a very useful read to begin some policy discussions, informing university administrations and policymakers on the reform of higher education. So there's a lot of that in the book from my perspective. I don't have sort of questions or anything for Daniela. I wasn't sure how this session was going to be organized, but I want to share some few remarks on only some of the many good ideas and food for thought in Daniela's book. And these are the remarks on things, there's plenty to say, but they are the things that really stood out for me. And if we have time in the end, I'll try to stick to the 10 minutes, but if we have time in the end, I would like to sort of suggest a few areas of future work based on my reading of the book. So my first comment is really on training in Egyptian universities on social sciences. We've read the book, we know that the authors of the original chapters, not everyone of course, questioned in very serious ways the quality of the training they received methodologically and theoretically. They all lamented the lack of proper supervision and the power that the senior professors had on them. And so in that context, I really, really want to start by a big shout out to the authors of the chapters, but also to Daniela, really, for the example he provided of how to train young academics and students. He actually, in my opinion, offers an exemplary mentorship, and I really focus on mentorship because it's a key word here in the way he dealt with the young authors. The book originated, as Daniela said, and was conceived and supported in the Global South. And this is something that Daniela is very wary of, and he talks about in the book, but I still think it's a great example of collaboration between North and South. Some of the young people who wrote the book, I know, have had some experience in writing and in research, but not all of them. I know that for all of them almost, this was the first time they wrote in an academic piece and had been published. So it's really a big deal what you did. And it was a very long and intensive process involving series of workshops. But also, and that's important, and he talked about it a bit, Daniele, it was very participatory and included a process of co-creation and empowering. I think we should really not underestimate at all what it means for young people in universities in Egypt to criticize so constructively their own institutions and their insiders in these institutions. So that's something to remember. And of course, the question I ask myself always in this case is, what remains of such good experiments and experiences, these rewarding and successful experiments? And the question for me, again, from that angle of change and reform is, how do we sustain and replicate and upscale these good examples in departments and in the universities and move from the small experiment to something big? The next point I want to make is something that Daniele says in the book, and I think important. He says that despite the constraints, research environment and material conditions do not fully determine the research writing. It shapes, but it does not determine the production of knowledge. I think this is important, and indeed we know that research and knowledge production is not necessarily related to a country's wealth and national income. But it would be, in my opinion, important in any future project and for all of us to remember to probe into what other factors come into play and that do not necessarily qualify as material conditions, but are very important. And in my mind, I'm thinking of the notion of the academic community. So a lot of people are increasingly talking about the need for an academic community as a prerequisite for the production and accumulation of knowledge, a community that would exchange views and challenge each other. It was said a lot that Arab scholars have stronger relations with the reference group in Western countries and institutions, much more than the way they relate to each other in their own local context. So that's important, but I think reading the book, a strong academic community is also needed to defend its interests and the rights of academics in Egypt. The chapter on academic freedom was just an eye-opener, and I was really struck by how fluid, relative, and non-principled the position of the academics in Egypt, you know, from that chapter. Of course, it was done on a very small scale, but still you get a feel that, you know, it's just a very fluid sort of picture or position towards academic freedom. And related to this, to the academic community question is perhaps the question of continuity and rupture between the young generation of social scientists and those who preceded them. It seems like a lot of the young people, and Mona says that towards the end, there's a lot of good work that has been done, it's just not remembered and not built on by the younger generations of Egyptians in that case. My last comment is really inspired by the chapter on internationalization. I remember I was interested in that chapter even at the time when it was still being written and presented. And it's really about the top-down approach towards reform of higher education in Egypt that came under titles of internationalization and international collaboration. And that the ultimate aim, it was claimed to, was to improve the knowledge production, among other things. I really thought that the experience of the European Studies Center in FEPS, in the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, was very important and could be learned from. So instead of an activity or a program that was supposed to include sort of exchange and reciprocation and exchange of visits and people coming to Egypt and people going to Europe from Egypt, it would, you know, with the aim of bringing the North and South together and increasing dialogue. It really ended up being a one-sided operation. It just it was not by any means a successful experiment, according to even the author. They continued to rely on very poor resources in the faculty, and business went as usual. It was striking that those collaborations were not even able to introduce a very basic idea for the European side, which was academic freedom, which they thought was essential for any social science work. So even they couldn't believe that this was happening. So this is important, but I think in my own view, what is more important in the notion of internationalization, the way it was implemented, was the relationship between internationalization and privatization of public education. So the idea was, in order for any student to get exposed to an international experience of that sort, they had to pay a lot of money in a public institution, and they also had to speak foreign languages, which is really a function of being a middle class, essentially. So the point here was that internationalization has contributed in major ways to the reproduction of educational inequality in Egyptian universities. And plus, there are no studies really that show that internationalization and privatization, either of them or both of them, has improved the quality of knowledge production. So of course, we know that the program has come to a stop. It's not working anymore. This is my understanding of the chapter, but really an experiment and an experience that one should look into more deeply. I'm done with the main sort of intervention that I wanted to do, but I do have 2 more comments. If you have 2 more minutes for me, I'll do them, but if I'm past my time, I can stop. Kai?
No, I think you can go ahead. It goes with the flow. So please add them, and we keep them in mind, and we can return to them in discussion. Yeah.
So I do have 2 sort of main questions for future research, or just ways to start a conversation on that. I think the book opens our eyes to areas where we can definitely advance our knowledge of what is happening to higher education, and in Egypt and the Arab region, for that matter. So my first point is that Daniele and the authors seem to think that there are and there have been improvements in the system. And I noticed just by reading it that there have been some spaces of change and resistance, and they get created. Some of them start as individual acts of pushing boundaries and envelopes, but they actually, in the end, result in big changes. And the example is clearly the case of Hala Kamel with the establishment of the gender as an area of studies in the faculty, in her own faculty. Also, I noticed that there is a group at FEPS, but I'm sure in the whole university, that still believes that, Arabic sections do a better job than, the fee-paying private foreign instruction departments or sections. And this is important, and I think it's a very constructive tension and resistance from within the institution against privatization and internationalization. I'm not saying that it's justified, but I'm just saying there is something happening. These acts of resistance and what transpires from them are important because the crisis of higher education still continues in Egypt and unravels as the current Egyptian government continues to invest in new semi-private universities in the new cities that they are establishing outside Cairo, and they're all conceived in collaboration with foreign countries and academic institutions. The second and last point is that the book really encourages us to assess and try to understand the success and failure of higher education reform that has now been going on for years, particularly in the area of knowledge production. So the number of private universities is almost as equal as, if not more, than public universities. And yet the number of students in private institutions has not exceeded 10%. We do not know much about the role of private institutions in the training and the production of knowledge in the social sciences. In fact, many of them do not have core social science departments. This is all in Daniele's book. Daniele also seems to be saying that the crisis and the discourse around it should not or are not the whole story. And this is true, because in the mind of people, public education and universities and public universities are still very prestigious and irreplaceable. And even students who can afford to go to private institutions still favor public universities. I think these are very important pieces of the puzzle that we need to put together in order to understand what is going on in Egyptian universities. This is the end of what I wanted to say, and Alf Mabruk to Daniele, and more to come, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mushira. I now briefly introduce David Mills, our second discussant. David Mills holds a PhD in social anthropology and is Associate Professor of Pedagogy and Social Sciences at the Department of Education, Oxford University. He's the Deputy Director of the Oxford Centre for Global Higher Education and also co-investigator of the Global Higher Education's research program on supranational higher education. And he's a member of the governing body fellow at Kellogg College. Among his numerous publications, I will point to 3 books. One is called Difficult Folk, published in 2008, A Political History of Social Anthropology. Then in 2005, together with Wendy James, The Quality of Time, Anthropological Approaches. And thematically closest to our current discussion here is his book, Teaching Rights and Wrongs, Universities and the Making of Anthropologists, published in 2004. Thank you very much, David, for joining us, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Oh, shukran, and thank you very much, all of you, for inviting me, Danielle especially. It's a pleasure to be here and to celebrate this book. And to celebrate Danielle's long journey in shepherding it. Collaborative research and writing is not easy. And I think this is a real achievement for everyone involved. And I think, I hope it gets the attention it deserves. So my comments really are sort of returning to the book and reflecting on some of the messages that come out of it. The first thing that strikes me is that this is not a book about oral research and knowledge production. This is really about the actual conditions of producing social science. Okay, so we mustn't overclaim too much, and that's partly because I think we have to go beyond the view of the world that's particularly in higher education studies says you can analyze everything from the bibliometric data. And if you only have to look at the latest reports on Egypt's citation data. Last week, a report came out saying it was the top producer of research in Africa. It makes up a quarter of all African research. Its productivity went up 20% last year. It's got 13 universities out of the top 30 in Africa. Great strengths, medical research, computing. So then the question then comes, okay, why the discourse of crisis? Well, of course, that's what this book helps us understand. Because the newspaper report about this sudden growth says, well, actually researchers in the social sciences, arts and humanities did less well. And I think the book sort of thickens and adds deep ethnographic nuance to this sort of very scanty bibliometric assessment. And the key message for me, and I think it's a challenging message for all of us really, is that it makes us question our sort of normative, almost unspoken commitment to the PhD we most of us have, and the way we got it, and its legitimacy it gives us, and our confidence we get from it. It's one of those situations where we're like fish in the water, and we're not quite aware of the water that we've benefited from, as in Bourdieu's terms, which is why the book's call for a really grounded local consideration of what the doctorate is, and what appropriate research is exactly what's driving this book. And we need to get beyond the view from the bibliometrics, the view from afar. And I found, I'm just going to choose a couple of chapters, but Ola Kabada's interviewees in the Euromed PhD program just absolutely capture this, because they're telling us, as it is, what they want their PhD for. I want a job at a private university, they pay well, they have appropriate hours, okay? It's for career advancement, it's for better grounded, pragmatic, prosaic responses. And from then we learn to question really perhaps our presuppositions about the PhD and our own attachment to the training and vocation we've got. As she puts it, and the purpose of a PhD is not necessarily creating knowledge, digging for new ideas, or mastering the art of conducting research. Perhaps it's about social mobility, perhaps it's about a better quality of living. So that helps us think then about the PhD as a cultural form that evolves, that travels. It's a changing academic assemblage with different agendas and investments. And that's going to be hard for us because I think it does mean that generationally people will make different things of it. And of course it's changing as people put more intention into training. And you only have to look at Jahata and Eldaka. They write about why there's a lack of publishing in social sciences in Egypt. And their conclusion is there's lack of incentives for international publication. Often it's language barriers, possibly writing skills, possibly lack of training. And you can see all of those things beginning to be addressed in Nafisa's paper, saying some of the things that are happening in terms of the Cairo Sociology Department. So there will be these changes, and there's going to be attention to shorter theses. 120 pages is quite a shock to kind of imagine that. Encouraging people to publish articles along the way, that's a change, but that also is something we'll have to accept. So what I take from this book then is that yes, the PhD is this culturally traveling form. Yes, it's being massified. In the same way as more people want to go to university, more people want to do a PhD. I don't think that necessarily undermines its total value, but I think it does require us to sort of separate out the PhD as a form of accreditation from the quality of intellectual discourse in our universities. And this is where I'll end then with Adnan El-Anin's sort of comments that it's really part of the problem here with the political governance of universities is the undermining of knowledge production, and that's a subtext clearly throughout this book, which is what's happening here to sort of diminish the quality of social science research, or possibly the way in which the PhD is valued, and perhaps as well as a sort of capital P politics going on, there is also the everyday politics of survival, and the prosaic stuff of being prepared, of why you're doing the PhD, of preparing for languages that might equally explain why we have this contradiction that Danielle presents us with. But I'm not going to take too much. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, but I would just say I think the combination of thoughtful empirical chapters by the research team and then the standing back and reflecting on the larger situation provides us with a really rich, great study. I think we need more books like this for other countries across the region and perhaps across Africa as well. So a big well done to you all, with a great achievement. Thank you.